So I'm going to tell you today a little bit about the history of the Russian immigrants in Brussels. Belgium has always been a very attractive country to Russians, especially in the 19th century. Not in the last place because the wife of the Dutch king and also Belgian king in the early 19th century was of Russian descent. To be more precise, she was the sister to the Russian Tsar. However, the influx of Russians as a group and the creation of a Russian colony in Brussels remounts to the 1860s, when formally a embassy was opened and not unimportant, a little Russian church was created in the Ridderstraat, Rue des Chevaliers in Ixelles. The bulk of the Russians arriving in the 19th century, however, remounts to the 1890s. This is due to strengthening of the political regime in Russia after the murder of Tsar Nicholas II in 1881. There were very strong limitations on personal freedoms in Russia, and also limitation of Russians, and especially Russians of Jewish descent, studying. So what happened is that many Russians fled abroad to receive education. Among them, many came to Belgium, at that time mainly to the city and University of Liège, but also a large group ended up in the so-called Université Nouvelle in Brussels, which was created in 1894, which was a progressive university and which attracted many foreigners, mainly from Slavic countries. At the beginning, Russians comprised roughly 50% of the student populations. By the end, so immediately before the First World War, they amounted up to 80%. What is very interesting to see is that these Russians, very often of Jewish origin, at the beginning of the First World War, some of them at least, volunteered for the Belgian army as a sign of recognition of their being helped and received in Belgium. What happened immediately after the First World War is an influx of Russian prisoners of war. These had been captured by the Germans, had been employed throughout Germany during the war, but also in Belgium. And so they wanted to return to Russia, and they either had to return through Germany, which was quite complicated, or either through Belgium in the direction of France. So many roamed the Belgian countryside, but also the city of Brussels in November and December 1918. And because there was such an unruly mob, eventually all these prisoners of war were put into camps, first in West Flanders and finally in the north of the province of Antwerp, and then were repatriated to Russia. So the Belgian government wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible, and they were repatriated in exchange for Belgians who were held hostage in Soviet Russia by the Bolsheviks. The next group that arrived in Belgium were actually also mainly military men, people who had fought during the First World War and during the Civil War in Russia on the side of the so-called White Armies, who were fighting the Reds, the Bolsheviks. So when that army, these white armies, I have to say, were defeated by the end of 1920, many Russian military men and their families fled from Russia via Crimea and Turkey through the Balkans, and then spread further through Europe. Many of them arrived in Belgium, first of all because quite a number of the leaders of the White Armies, among them the descendants of General Kornilov, General Denikin, came to Belgium, and especially in 1924, General Pyotr Wrangel, who had been the last general to fight the Bolsheviks in Crimea, arrived in Belgium. His family had arrived in Belgium prior to that in 1923, where his children went to schools in Brussels. And his arrival, so the main military leader of the Russian opposition in Belgium, triggered an influx and especially an interest among Russians abroad to come to Belgium. He was helped by his secretary, Nikolai Katylarevsky, and also a Russian Corsican entrepreneur here in Brussels, Emmanuel Fricero, who actually helped settle Russian former military men in Belgium, among them as workers in his building company. So what attracted Russians to Belgium, apart from the fact that their military leaders were here? Very often it is said that the Russians sympathized or felt sympathy for Belgium because Belgium was a monarchy, and they kind of pretended or wanted to believe that the Belgian monarchy was a kind of alter ego of the Tsarist regime that had vanished in 1917. Whether it's true or not that King Albert personally saw to the welfare of Russian emigres and was responsible for the Belgian refusal to recognize the Soviet Union until 1935 is rather questionable. The king did not decide about Belgian foreign policy, but at least the Russians believed that the king was protecting them. Another point of attraction for Russians to come to Belgium was the fact that the Catholic Church in Belgium, which dominated education, actually in the name or by through the person of Cardinal Mercier, actually opened up Catholic schools for Russian pupils, and in the case of the University of Leuven, students. So many people came to Belgium because it offered opportunities for learning and education to their children, and many were spread throughout the country, in Leuven, but also in boarding schools in West Flanders or in Wallonia, but the families remained in Brussels. So whereas the Russian emigration before 1914 was kind of concentrated in Liège, after 1918, Brussels became the capital of Russian Belgium. Apart from these military men with monarchist sympathies, there was a third pole of attraction to these Russians, and that was the idea that possibly here in Belgium they could join forces with Belgian military, among them those who had fought in Russia during the First World War, and with other political actors to organize the fight against communism. And what you see is that a center of attraction or a meeting place for these people became the Russian church in the Rue des Chevaliers. The problem there was that the church in the Rue des Chevaliers de facto became independent from the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. and that the leaders of that church, in the eyes of many of these monarchist military men, was too soft in terms of politics. And they started to sympathize with a dissident stream in Russian Orthodoxy abroad, the so-called synodical church, who actually wanted to reinstate Tsarist rule in Russia and very strictly identified Russian identity with Orthodoxy. They created a church in the Rue des Drapiers, a couple of hundred of meters from the church in the Rue des Chevaliers. And actually this monarchist, fiercely anti-communist, very much politically engaged parish would start to collect money to build a new church in neo-Russian style as of the 1930s, and that church still exists. It's on Avenue des Frères in Uccle. What you see is that because of this mentality in this group, there was lots of interest also from abroad for the opportunities that were offered to Russians in Belgium. Although the Belgian government, like in other countries in the 1930s, urged Russians and foreigners on the whole to leave the available work to Belgians, it became clear that that Brussels became an interesting center or formed a kind of concentration of monarchist, anti-communist thinking Russians, and especially in the second half of the 1930s, after in France a leftist Popular Front had come to power, many of these Russians who were in France and were afraid that they might be expelled to Soviet Russia came to Belgium. And it is precisely in the second half of the 1930s that this mentality, this leniency on behalf of the Belgian authorities towards these, well, extremists probably, or right-wing thinkers, allowed for a couple of people to arrive in Belgium, and these people effectively stirred up things. Whereas this group roughly tried to integrate, find work, was concerned about social promotion of their descendants, these people actually wanted to mobilize Russians in Belgium and especially in Brussels. The first of them was Vasily Aryakov, who had been the editor of the military review of Russian military in exile in Paris, and who fled to Belgium, and who would continue to publish his journal until 1998, right before his death. He would, after the Second World War, become the mouthpiece of the descendants of the White Russian armies. A second man who arrived in Brussels was Yuri Wojciechowski. He was a man who had grown up in Poland, who had been condemned for an attempted murder on the Soviet representative in Warsaw, had left jail, and received an invitation to come to Brussels and study at the University of Leuven. And what he effectively did was try to concentrate the Russian youth around extreme rightists and effectively, in the longer run, Nazist ideas. That Yuri Wojciechowski would also be the man who, as of 1941, when the war between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany broke out, would become the official representative of the Russian community with the Nazi occupiers. Official representative, that is on behalf of the Germans and on behalf of himself. He was not much loved by the majority of the Russian emigres. But he pulled some of these emigres effectively also into the collaboration. Wojciechowski was killed during the liberation of Brussels in the early days of September 1944. And the third man who arrived in Belgium was a certain Boris Salanievich. He was one of the founders of the Scout movement in Russia and in the early Soviet times. He then had passed long spells in Soviet jails and eventually escaped in 1936, first to Bulgaria and then to Belgium, where he set up, in Brussels, he set up a youth sporting club, attracting many of these youth who were interested in activism against Bolshevik Russia. Salanievich himself being a wrestle champion, so this also kind of attracted sympathy. However, he was kind of, during his whole period in Brussels, he was suspected by many of the Russians who had arrived earlier on, precisely because he had come from Soviet Russia. So every new incomer from Soviet Russia was deemed a potential spy, which in his case was not as such. But he eventually, on the instigation of Wojciechowski, was arrested by the Germans, was incarcerated in Breendonk, and so on and so further. After the Second World War, he would flee, or he would leave to the United States because he also came into conflict with Vasily Aryakov, the self-proclaimed leader of the Russian white emigres after the Second World War. What happened immediately after the war is that the Soviet Union wanted Russian emigres, and not only those who had collaborated, wanted them extradited to Soviet Russia. Fortunately, the Belgian government did not accept that. Moreover, Russians who had collaborated during the war were not, or at least not judicially persecuted, because according to the Belgian law, only Belgian citizens could be persecuted for treason, and as they were stateless, they were not Belgian citizens and kind of were exempt of this rule. But many were persecuted administratively, and others, let's call them the worst cases, would flee to Germany or to South America. What is also important is that this interwar period group kind of met with competition from newcomers after the Second World War. The so-called displaced people, Soviet citizens who, because of the war, had ended up somewhere in Europe, in Austria, in the Balkans, in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, and then rather than risking being sent to Soviet concentration camps by Stalin, actually fled further to the west, and among others ended up in Belgium. These two groups, so the interwar period group and the post-Second World War group, did not get on very well with each other. Whereas the interwar period group were self-claimed representatives of the Russian culture that had been extinguished by the Soviets, these DP were people who were born and brought up in Soviet Russia and who were representatives actually of Soviet culture and identity. These people also would, and especially the women among them, many who came from what is now Ukraine, many of them would end up in the so-called friendship organizations with the Soviet Union, and would kind of keep in touch with relatives in Soviet Russia. Not so for the Russian migrants who had arrived after 1917. To a certain extent, this tension or these tensions between these two generations very much resemble the ones between the Russians who had arrived in Belgium before the First World War, who very often were sympathizing with revolutionary movements in Russia. Many of them had returned to Soviet Russia immediately after Russian revolutions, but many of them were also Jews, and those who had remained in Belgium very often were killed during the Second World War. Well, the Russians who arrived after 1917 and the Russians who had been in Belgium and so who are leftist sympathizers and Jews, they did not get on with each other as well. So in this sense, these three generations kind of resemble, or the enmity between these generations are very much alike. What we see happen is that the majority of the Russian migrants, and that was the largest group, who were living in Belgium and then especially concentrated in Brussels, that after the Second World War, they exchanged their status of stateless people for a UN status, which gave them much more protection, or otherwise, and especially those who had been born in Belgium, obtained Belgian citizenship. So they kind of fully integrated after two, maybe 3 decades of hesitation, fully integrated into Belgian society. What is remarkable that after 1991, so when communists came to an end in Soviet Russia, many of these Russian migrants of the interwar period, or at least the second or third generation of them, welcomed, for obvious reasons, the fall of communism, but they were also very much solicited by the new Russian authorities, who wanted to get rid of the cultural mentality of the Soviet Union, and believed that these Russian emigres were a kind of had been able to preserve the pre-revolutionary Russian culture on which the new Russian regime would be building after 1991. And what we see very often is a very ambiguous relationship between these Russians, so descendants of this post-1917 generation, with the present-day Russian regime. They welcomed the return of Russian nationalist pre-revolutionary thinking, and they sometimes condone actions of the regime that in the eyes of many people in the West are not really acceptable. In short, and I'm now kind of repeating something Russians told me a couple of times, Russian emigres, or at least descendants of that interwar wave, they pretend that they may be the best and last Belgians for several reasons. First of all, they are extremely monarchist, so they kind of are strong adherents of the Belgian royal family as a kind of replacement of the former Tsarist family. Secondly, they have completely identified with typical Francophone Belgium identities. So they even, in many cases, have lost their language, although many of their cultural activities are still in place. And thirdly, and that's also part of the deal, they're mainly living in Brussels, the capital city.